I'm your host, Hillary Bricken, and this is the Cannabis Law Now podcast, where we regularly discuss issues related to the cannabis industry, including investment, day-to-day operational issues, and potential reform on the horizon that will impact all cannabis businesses and investors in the United States. Hey everybody, welcome to the Cannabis Law Now podcast. And today we have Dina Rollman joining us, who is the CEO of StrainBrain, the co-founder of the KND Group, and on the board of New Lake Capital Realty. And I feel very fortunate to have Dina on today because she has been doing this at least as long as me or longer, which is terrifying. And I think she's worn literally close to every hat you possibly can in this industry and ridden out the lean times and the fat time. So I know she's going to share a lot with us today. Welcome, Dina.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Okay, let's dive into it. So for people who don't know you that listen to this podcast, and it's going to be attorneys, regulators, investors, stakeholders, operators, can you give us a little bit of your background in the cannabis world, namely starting from your days in Illinois as a cannabis business and regulatory attorney all the way to where you are now?
Sure, happy to. So in 2014, Illinois' medical cannabis law went into effect. I'm based in Chicago. I had been a practicing attorney doing litigation, business litigation for 14 years at that point, more or less, and was pretty solidly in that, sort of corporate law reality. But when Illinois legalized medical cannabis, it did so legislatively, which meant that there was a nice, 100-page law that I could pull down. And I just started reading it and got very excited because it was so specific that it literally mapped out exactly what Illinois' industry would look like. It said there's going to be 60 dispensaries, 21 cultivation facilities. This is the parts of the state they can be in. This is, all the requirements of how it operates, what kind of money you have to have, et cetera, et cetera. So it allowed me to actually just visualize it and see what was coming out of and being created basically out of nothing. And given that it's so highly regulated, it just seemed obvious to me that the industry was going to need attorneys willing to do something that was, technically violating federal law, no big deal for a lawyer, and guide, clients on how to operate their business in compliance with the state regulations. I started giving continuing legal education presentations about the Illinois medical cannabis law, and that led to me being introduced by a mutual friend to Ben Kovler, who was at that time putting together his initial group for Green Thumb Industries. Getting everybody on the team had day jobs, but let's put together this team to apply and take our best shot. And the group didn't have a lawyer. So I quickly got sort of absorbed into the group, which was just really fortunate. Was able to keep my day job, but get permission from my, the owners of my law firm to sort of take a little sabbatical and just devote full-time efforts to the GTI applications. And we had, an incredibly hardworking, dedicated team that just left it all on the mat for those applications. And in February 2015, we got the good news that we had won 3 cultivation licenses out of the 21 and 1 dispensary license. Huge win, kind of bigger than I had ever even hoped. And by that point, I was so into all of this. It was so exciting to have this opportunity to build a new industry that I scandalized parents and everybody around me. And I quit my job as a partner at a law firm so I could do cannabis law full time, which wasn't even really a thing at the time. As you know, I think you were the only other person I knew of in the country, basically, who was sort of hanging themselves out there as a cannabis law attorney at the time. And the needs for Green Thumb in those early days were just fast and furious because every single aspect of how we built out a cultivation facility and a dispensary and grew plants and sold product, every single bit of it had regulations attached to it. And, kind of one false move and you were at risk of losing your license. So I very quickly was just, really having to pay very close attention to every single aspect of the business, which was, exhausting and stressful because you really felt at that point that there was just no room for error. But at the same time, I had a great team that just wanted to win, wanted to do it the right way. So it was a matter of just really staying in touch on everything. So did that. We got Illinois' first approval to cultivate cannabis. That was in, I want to say, July of 2015. And we opened our dispensary on the first day that Illinois allowed sales. That was November 2015. And from there, it was, very quickly learning how to actually operate these businesses on a day-to-day basis in a compliant way, and the myriad of legal issues that come up every single day that still do, I'm sure, for many operators. And you get those calls, right? Every day there's some new wrinkle, some new little fire to put out. So that's what that was like. And then at the same time, we started applying for more of the licenses. So, I led the application team to apply in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Ohio. And we won licenses there. So suddenly the business became an MSO sort of organically very quickly through those license wins. And so then that meant paying attention to the specific regulations of each of those markets and making sure that as we built out our facilities and began operating, we were doing it in line with Pennsylvania laws or Ohio laws or Maryland laws, which everyone who's in the industry knows, of course, are all different. There's different wrinkles to each market. And at the same time, helping build GTI's internal team, right? As we were expanding into multiple states, you need more and more of an infrastructure, and, headquarters became, really key to mind all the details of construction and compliance and legal and accounting and HR and all of that. So it was awesome. It was the true, sort of build a plane while you're flying it. But, smart, hardworking group that, was just very good at problem solving. So we just kept knocking down, knocking down hurdles and just kept going. And then in 2018, we went public on the Canadian Securities Exchange. And then at that time, I think that was around when I saw that we really had a need at that point for a government affairs department. Backing up, I had basically been leading our regulatory compliance. And I was one of two in-house attorneys. So Brett Kravitz, who's GTI's general counsel now, it was sort of me and Brett, and he came from a transactional law background and I came from litigation. So we had a pretty nice division of labor naturally, where all the sort of corporate law issues that came up, Brett handled, and I was sort of the everything else bucket. And then our legal team grew. And in 2018, I created our government affairs department. At that point, or I don't know, probably in close to 10 states, and trying to figure out how to lobby for, better state laws and state regulations in each market, and work with lobbyists and work with trade associations really was just too big of a need at that point to not have some dedicated resource. So I created that department and led government affairs until I left GTI in 2023.
And I totally forgot that Illinois adopted its initial medical law legislatively. And so many of the others, right, have gone on voter initiative, both medical and adult use. Do you think that helped you guys hit the ground running? That it was essentially, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it was funny because in the early days, my team, as we were building out our facilities and just, early days of operating a dispensary, I would get questions all day long, can we do this? Can we do that? And basically I could, do a find on the statute or the regs and find the answer within 30 seconds. My team thought I was a genius, as if I had, all of this knowledge just stored in my brain already. But really, it was all, made pretty black and white on paper. So it was just a matter of, I was very comfortable as a lawyer reading through dense regulations and statutes. I could kind of maneuver around quickly, so I could have answers really quickly. But I was really grateful, honestly, that most of the time there actually was an answer.
Yeah, and I came from the land of voter initiatives, which is always interesting. And of course, that's like a total negotiation with the public over what they'll tolerate. And sometimes there's some contradictions there. Okay, so wore the lawyer hat for many, many years, obviously, but now you're not practicing law anymore. At least I don't think you're not. When did you decide to ditch the lawyer side for the business side in the industry? And why? More than when. I think you said when, but more why did you decide to do that?
Well, I guess, in some ways I really am still practicing law. It's just not in such a formal way as before, but, I'll explain that. But, when I got to do the entrepreneurial journey that I did at GTI for, almost 10 years, I worked so closely with the business side, with Ben Kovler, the founder CEO, and Anthony Georgiadis, who's the president. that was where like the excitement was and the juice, it was like that feeling of like building all the time, problem solving. And it was just so much more fun to me than my previous life. As a litigator, generally it was, the client's coming to you when everything's gone wrong for a business and saying, okay, now we're ready to fight about what happened. And so you're sort of looking backwards. You weren't a part of the business decisions that got made, and it's too late to solve the problems, right? So I loved really flipping where I fell in line in a company, which was at the growth stage and problem solving and avoiding litigation. Frankly, I wasn't looking to like buy myself more litigation. So it was really a matter of approaching things as, how do you work cooperatively? How do you navigate conflict with your counterparties, et cetera? So I really truly loved it. I learned so much. I came into GTI is a fairly typically risk averse attorney. When you're dealing with litigation, you've seen all the things that can go wrong, and you're fighting in court, and the other side is always picking into every little detail. And if you get, you get one statement wrong, you get one fact wrong, you can really get hurt by that. So you're just mitigating risk all the time as a lawyer for your law firm and for your clients. And when I think now, like who I what my risk tolerance was in 2014 when I got involved versus, 11 years later now, I'm like a different person. I was able to see that you don't have to sweat every risk, and, some amount of risk is good. And I've learned much more to trust my judgment about how to assess risk and then go ahead and take some. So once you sort of have that transition and make that journey, it would be hard for me to go back to, solely wearing the legal hat.
Oh, I bet. I bet. And when you were an industry lawyer full time or in-house full time, can you give me maybe your top two biggest success stories while you were in the chair there?
Sure. I mean, one that always stands out to me is, under Illinois' medical cannabis statute, you had only 6 months from the time you were, told you had a provisional license. So that was February of 2015. You had 6 months to build out your facility and have plants in the ground. So, but you're in Illinois because you're only one of, we had two of the 21 cultivation facilities. These are really large scale facilities. This is like building out a Costco and starting to grow plants within 6 months. I mean, logistically, it's insane. It was a huge task. And the regulators were basically saying, this is a real requirement. And if you don't meet it, you're at risk of losing your license. And that was obviously just, failure was not an option on that front. So marshaling the forces internally, with Ben and the others to sort of on an operational level, get a building built, get your grow equipment, all of that, was insane, but we did it. And so when it came time within that 6 months that we were ready for that inspection to get permission to start growing, we were the first ones in the state who were ready. So the head regulator for cultivation comes out to our facility. And to be honest, he looked almost as nervous as I was. I mean, I had never, led an inspector through an inspection at that point of a cultivation facility, and knowing that there were 8 million requirements that he was going to look for us to meet. And he had never given permission to a company to start growing marijuana in Illinois. So it was kind of a partnership in that way that, we were both feeling our way through, but we did it, and we passed that inspection, and we got permission to start growing. And it just felt like just a huge achievement. And it felt great to have that regulator sort of express that level of like trust and confidence in our ability to do it and do it right. It was validation for our team that somehow we seemed to have pulled off the impossible. So I will never forget that day, and, always enjoy that memory.
Yeah, that's a good one. And I relish those old memories too in the early days because there was so much momentum and it was very, very cool to be a part of it. And now transitioning to life today, your very diverse interests on the business side, which I really enjoy and I think it's fascinating. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience with New Lake Capital and what it does? And then I'll move into probably your newest baby, StrainBrain, which I really want to talk about.
Definitely, definitely. So through my corporate law background, where honestly a lot of the litigation I did was director and officer liability, meaning directors or officers were being sued for not discharging their duties appropriately for various companies. I got really familiar with what their roles are. What are you supposed to do as a director or officer? What are you not supposed to do? Sort of, and got to I honestly defend, quite a few directors and officers. So I was always very interested in that role. I liked that viewpoint that they had where you're not exactly in the business day to day, but you're really responsible for steering a company, providing guidance, using your judgment. So I always enjoyed those relationships and that exposure, and always really did have a goal to be a director at some point. I recently got appointed as an independent director on the board of New Lake Capital Realty, which is a publicly traded real estate investment trust that leases properties to cannabis operators. So think large scale cultivation facilities, dispensary properties, et cetera. New Lake is led by its CEO, Anthony Coniglio, who any listeners here who have, either encountered him on other podcasts or just in the day to day, excellent person, excellent operator. It's again gives me that chance to work with a CEO and learn so much, just from that perspective, but also start, using that muscle that I sort of felt that I had to provide guidance as a director. And, for the New Lake board in particular, because they are leasing to the cannabis industry, it really is very important to them to keep a pulse on what's happening from a legal and regulatory front. So I am still in all of this day to day and paying attention to the legal and regulatory, developments. So it's just sort of a natural fit for me to have those conversations.
Got it. Okay. And now, StrainBrain. So when I saw you a couple months ago at one of these big omnibus cannabis conferences, I know you were talking to people about this idea and the deliverables and everything. So share it here so our listeners can know what StrainBrain is.
Sure. So last year, some locals in my neighborhood, just such a small world, right? Some non-cannabis people who live in my neighborhood, walking distance, asked me to meet them for coffee because they had this business idea that they really just wanted me to weigh in on from like a cannabis industry perspective. Not that I would have a role in the company, but just, hey, we have this business idea. What do you think of it? And so I met with them, and the idea was to acquire StrainBrain. StrainBrain is an AI powered bud tender. So basically, it's technology that had been invented by a couple of 26-year-old Canadians who are, brainiacs to say the least. And over the course of 4 years, they had built an algorithm that took proprietary data about cannabis strains and their effects and mapped them out, and then allows a consumer to shop a cannabis dispensary menu by what effect they are seeking, and StrainBrain does its little algorithmic thing and pops out with the top 3 product recommendations that fit that customer's desired effect. So StrainBrain has already existed for a few years in market. So they showed me how it works. Greenlight is probably StrainBrain's biggest customer right now. Greenlight has StrainBrain running at all 33 stores. So any listeners are welcome to go on the Greenlight website and go to their menu and check it out. Super simple. It's a sort of a plug-in on that e-commerce menu, whether it's Dutchy or Jane, and it says, get a recommendation ? And we know that a lot of customers these days, when they're navigating that e-com menu, whether they're online at home or on their phone or in the store at the kiosk, if you decide you want to pick up some flower, you may be scrolling 7 pages of potential products, and you're looking at terminology like indica or sativa or terpene or THC percentage or CBN, CBG. I mean, there's just so many words and letters that, your average cannabis consumer isn't familiar with. So we know it can be a very intimidating experience. And that's borne out by the fact that there are a lot of abandoned shopping carts online when people are shopping, because they just get a little frustrated or intimidated that they don't know how to feel confident about the purchase they're making. So when there's StrainBrain there and it just says, what form factor are you looking for? And everything gives you a choice. You never have to think of what question to ask. None of the questions involve, terminology. It's just what form factor do you want? And then what effect are you looking for? And it gives you, 8 options. Are you sleepy, relaxed, energized, focused? What flavor profile? Gives you 8 choices. You can skip that if you don't care. But if you want earthy versus flowery or versus vanilla, you can indicate that. And then how strong do you want it? And rather than having to understand THC percentages or ratios or things like that, there's just a little slider bar. It's like, less strong, more strong. Just very intuitive. So you get through these 4 clicks in, I don't know, 30 seconds, hit submit. And then the algorithm is looking at what's in that particular store's inventory, matching it up against those 4 choices that you made and saying, here are your top 3 matches objectively, and gives you like a percentage match. This is a 97% match for what you wanted. This was a 92 and this was an 89. And then you can click on that and just add it, then you're back into the ecom menu and you can add it to your cart. So it's very seamless, very fast, no terminology. So when I saw that, my reaction was, I want to use that. I want my local dispensary to offer me that option. Because even though I'm 11 years into the industry, when I'm confronted with 100 options for anything in life, I'm just tired. I'm like, please, don't make me scroll through 100 options of anything. I just don't have the time or patience. And even I don't really know how to distinguish between 100 different indicas. I want an indica leaning hybrid. Great. There are so many of those from so many producers. I just, really am often at a loss. So I love how this just expedited that decision making, gives you confidence in the purchase you're making. So I told, the guys I met with, I love this. I think it's a great idea. I would support it. Okay, great. And then, they reached back out to me well, can we talk more? And long story short, I became the CEO of StrainBrain, and we did a friends and family investor round, enough to acquire the technology from these two 26-year-olds. So good for them. They had their first exit at 26, which is pretty cool. And then, we have a core team. The co-founders are Noel Berkman, who is my neighbor here, just by coincidence. He does not come from cannabis world. And Steve Horowitz, who's based in Florida. And our head of product is Ed Brill, who spent about 20 years at IBM running their Lotus Notes division. So we have, a very seasoned team with, 15, 20 or more years of experience in e-com, sales, and technology. And so they brought all of that to the table, and I was able to bring the, sort of understanding of the cannabis industry. And so I really like the team. And now what we're doing is just expanding StrainBrain into more markets, more stores. The other thing that really excited me about StrainBrain was that in addition to improving the customer experience, it's actually a great, easy unlock to grow revenue. We have, plenty of data to show now that on average, when a customer uses StrainBrain to make their product recommendation, they spend $11 to $12 more per transaction. And that translates into, on average, about 22% in increase in incremental revenue for your transactions. And that is simply by just having, this AI bud tender software running on your online menu. So you're not hiring additional people. You're not, just sinking more money into, marketing efforts that you don't know if they'll work or not. This is proven. So it's we see it as a marketing spend, not an IT tech stack spend, because it's something you're doing that in providing a better customer experience just has a positive impact directly to your bottom line.
And I'm always happy to see kind of innovation land in the cannabis industry. I think it needs it desperately, whether it's new product offerings, new experiences, tourism, you name it. It just helps kind of push its legitimacy forward and makes it more normalized. And on that note, AI and cannabis, people talked about for a long time. How would these two integrate? And are we talking automated grows where it's just robots or whatever? Realistically, do you think there's anything else out there for AI and cannabis? Something that's actually utilitarian, like being able to scroll menus very quickly and aggregate information to make an informed choice. Do you think there's other stuff out there that people are missing in the AI cannabis world?
Well, there were a lot of conversations that I've had at conferences and just networking around in the last 6 months. And the number one topic that is coming up related to AI is data. There's a real hunger in this industry for consolidated data that will help with demand planning, inventory management, a more personalized customer experience, which is, what StrainBrain is providing, integration, with kind of the data that they're getting from their loyalty programs. There's so many touch points in the cannabis industry from seed to sale and tons of data collected along the way. I don't think we've seen yet the full impact of AI in sort of collecting and synthesizing that data, making it more predictive and more sort of, easily digestible and usable for your day-to-day operators.
And you mentioned conferences, and I have, two more questions for you while I have you, and this is one of them. You've been in this for a long time, and the common joke is, 1 year in the cannabis industry is like 7 dog years or whatever. What do you notice now, the biggest difference between the early days of conferences you used to attend and the ones you go to now? Because I'm pretty knocked down by it. It makes me feel very old and almost out of touch. Not quite, but how do you feel going to conferences now compared to, 11 years ago?
Well, it's funny that you asked. Last week I was at NECANN Boston, and it certainly hit me that, in the early years of cannabis, when you went to any type of either regional or national conference, the operators were there. So, Ben Kohler was at, well, I don't know if he ever went to MJBiz actually. Maybe he went once. I'm not sure. He was never big on conferences, but, the rest of our team and, Cresco and Curaleaf, like all our counterparts of the MSOs, you would go and you would see the founder CEOs there. You would see their executive team. You would see, their market presidents, et cetera. So like leadership was at these conferences, networking with each other, meeting with, lenders, analysts, things like that. A lot of the sort of business was being done and at those conferences. And so the people that you got to know in the industry were sort of all there. There were tons of like familiar faces and friends. And my feeling at, the conferences I've been to lately is that most businesses, they just can't afford the time away from the store, from the grow, from the business to be hanging out at a conference. It's lean times and, somewhat dire for quite a few operators. So the attendance is still there. Attendance is strong, but it's just a different makeup. And I would say it's made up of a lot of like the much newer operators who are still hungry to make connections and learn. They're still figuring out their service providers. So they do want to meet with, somebody providing lighting equipment or grow equipment or rolling machines or whatever, a green thumb. At this point, if they want new lighting equipment or HVAC or whatnot, like they don't need to go to a conference to sort of evaluate those options, right?
Yeah. Somebody needs to disrupt the conference circuit. Maybe you could work on that next to make them attractive again. Okay, so final question. It's an unfair one because it's such a big question, but you have so much experience and specialized knowledge. I would like your input if you can afford it. In the next 2 years, what do you think the number one challenge is for this industry? Because like you said, it's dire, it's flat. What do you think it is? The biggest hurdle?
I mean, I would broadly just say money, but not like a normal business where like, sure, every business in America is like, yeah, I would like to make more money. Sure. I don't mean it that simply, but just, we're still in this horrible position as an industry where there's just not that access to capital and related the impact of 280E. And you take those two factors together, which I'm just broadly calling money. And it's like, wow, you're, being taxed at a completely exorbitant, unfair, unsustainable rate. And you can't access traditional, bank loans at traditional, just regular rates. Like cannabis businesses still just aren't treated like normal businesses. We can't list on the major exchanges. Like just, it feels like every avenue that every cannabis operator is looking to right now to put themselves in a financially healthier position, it's like just roadblocked everywhere. So you can be such a great like lean operator and efficient and allocate capital well and all the things. But there's some factors here that until there's, legislative and regulatory change, you're just sort of like fighting with one arm tied behind your back.
Fair enough. I agree. And I really do hope something can turn it around, whether it's new states coming online somehow or ultimately federal reform, but only time will tell. So, Dina Rollman, thank you for your time. CEO, director, queen of the cannabis universe. We really, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that concludes today's episode of the Cannabis Law Now podcast. Until next time, stay alert, stay alive.